Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is as you press play, we're honored to keep you company as you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the stillness around you, and the space you've made to simply let go. If you enjoy this experience, we invite you to subscribe to the Sleep Library. We create gentle, slow, and calming stories to help you sleep. Stories you won't hear anywhere else. And in the comments below, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Your words help us build a global, restful little community. One quiet listener at a time. Now, if you're ready, let's travel back to a time not often remembered.
In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg rested quietly along the Rhine River, its cobblestone streets warm beneath the gentle European sun. This was a city of roughly 20,000 souls, nestled in the Holy Roman Empire, where the rhythm of daily life moved with the predictable cadence of medieval routine. The morning bells would ring softly across the red-tiled roofs, calling citizens to their daily prayers and labors, while the evening chimes would signal the close of another ordinary day. Strasbourg was a place where time seemed to flow like honey, thick and slow, measured not by minutes, but by the gradual turning of seasons and the patient repetition of generations. The city's inhabitants lived their lives according to patterns established long before their birth, patterns that their children would likely follow long after their passing. In the workshops scattered throughout the narrow alleyways, craftsmen worked leather and wood with the same techniques their grandfathers had used, their hands moving in smooth, practiced motions that required little conscious thought. The marketplace, located in the heart of the city near the towering cathedral, was a place of gentle commerce where vendors spoke in hushed tones about their wares. Merchants would arrive each morning with carts full of grain, vegetables, and handmade goods, spreading their offerings across wooden tables that had been worn smooth by decades of use. The conversations here were unhurried, conducted in the local dialect that mixed German with French influences, creating a linguistic tapestry as complex and layered as the city's history itself. In this summer of 1518, the political landscape was as calm as a still pond. The Holy Roman Empire stretched across much of Central Europe, a vast network of territories and principalities that governed themselves under the distant authority of Emperor Maximilian I. For the average citizen of Strasbourg, imperial politics were as remote as the stars, affecting their daily lives no more than the weather patterns over distant mountains. Local governance was handled by a city council of merchants and guild leaders, men who understood the importance of maintaining stability and order in their prosperous trading community. The religious life of Strasbourg flowed with the same steady rhythm as everything else in the city. The massive Gothic cathedral dominated the skyline, its single spire reaching toward heaven like a stone prayer frozen in time. Within its cool, shadowy interior, the faithful would gather for services that had been conducted in essentially the same manner for centuries. The Latin prayers rolled off tongues with the familiarity of lullabies, while the soft light filtering through stained glass windows painted the worshippers in blues and reds and golds that seemed to pulse gently with each passing cloud. The social structure of Strasbourg was as clearly defined as the layers of sediment in the riverbank. At the top of society sat the wealthy merchants and guild masters, men who had accumulated enough wealth to live in stone houses with glazed windows and private courtyards. Below them were the skilled craftsmen and shopkeepers, people who lived comfortably if not luxuriously, their homes marked by wooden shutters and small gardens, where they grew herbs and vegetables for their tables. At the bottom of the social ladder were the labourers and servants, individuals whose lives were defined by physical work, and whose homes were simple affairs of wood and clay. Yet despite these social divisions, there was a sense of community that permeated the city like morning mist. Neighbors knew each other's names and family histories, going back generations. Children played in the streets under the watchful eyes of adults who treated them as if they were their own offspring. When someone fell ill or faced hardship, the community would quietly rally to provide assistance, not through any formal organization, but through the natural impulse of people who understood that their fates were intertwined. The economy of Strasbourg hummed along with the quiet efficiency of a well-maintained mill wheel. The city's location on the Rhine made it a natural stopping point for merchants traveling between the German states and France. Boats would dock at the riverside wharves, their holds filled with goods from distant lands, spices from the east, wool from England, wine from the southern regions of France. These goods would be unloaded, sorted, and either sold in the local market or loaded onto other vessels for transport to destinations further up or down the river. The guild system provided structure to this economic activity, with each trade organized under the watchful eye of experienced masters who ensured that quality standards were maintained and that younger workers received proper training. The Bakers' Guild oversaw the production of bread, that most essential of foodstuffs, ensuring that loaves were of proper weight and quality. The Weavers' Guild supervised the creation of textiles, from the finest silk garments worn by the wealthy to the sturdy wool clothing that kept common folk warm during the cold winter months. As summer deepened in 1518, the city settled into its warmest months with the contentment of a cat finding a sunny windowsill. The days were long and bright, with sunset coming late enough that people could work outdoors well into the evening hours. Gardens bloomed with vegetables and flowers, while fruit trees heavy with apples and pears cast cooling shadows over courtyards and alleyways. Children would play games that had been passed down through generations, their laughter echoing softly of the stone walls of buildings that had witnessed countless such summers. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, families would gather in their homes for simple meals of bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables or meat they could afford. Conversations would drift lazily from topic to topic: the weather, the crops, local gossip, plans for the next day. These were not momentous discussions, but rather the gentle exchange of information and opinion that binds communities together like mortar between stones. The nights in Strasbourg were peaceful, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps on cobblestone as the night watchman made his rounds, or the distant howl of a dog responding to some sound only it could hear. Most citizens retired early, their days beginning before dawn, and their bodies needing rest to prepare for the physical labor that tomorrow would bring. Sleep came easily in this city, as natural and necessary as breathing, and dreams, when they came, were usually simple affairs involving familiar faces and everyday activities. This, then, was Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, a city where life moved at the pace of seasons, where change came gradually, and was usually welcomed only if it brought obvious benefits, where the greatest excitement might be a wedding celebration or a harvest festival. It was a place where the extraordinary seemed not just unlikely but almost unimaginable, where the boundaries between the possible and impossible seemed as fixed and permanent as the stones of the cathedral itself. Yet beneath this placid surface, currents were stirring that no one could have predicted, forces as mysterious and unstoppable as the underground streams that fed the city's wells. In a few short weeks, this peaceful community would witness events so strange and unprecedented that people would struggle to find words to describe them. Events that would challenge every assumption about the nature of human behavior and the boundaries of the possible. But for now, in these quiet summer days of 1518, Strasbourg rested in blissful ignorance of what was to come, its citizens going about their daily routines with the confidence that tomorrow would bring nothing more surprising than perhaps a change in the weather, or news of some minor political development in a distant corner of the empire. The stage was set, though no one knew it, for one of history's most puzzling and extraordinary episodes. On a morning that began like any other in July 1518, the narrow streets of Strasbourg were filled with the usual sounds of awakening commerce. Shopkeepers were opening their shutters, letting the early morning light spill across counters laden with yesterday's bread and this morning's fresh milk. The air carried the familiar scents of wood smoke from cooking fires and the earthy smell of horses and oxen that would soon be pulling carts through the city's winding passages. In one of these streets, a street whose name has been lost to history, but whose character we can imagine with perfect clarity, stood a woman who would soon become the center of one of the most bewildering events in recorded history. Her name was Frau Trophir, and on this particular morning, she appeared to be nothing more than another housewife going about her daily errands. She was dressed in the typical fashion of her social class, a simple woolen dress that fell to her ankles, a white linen cap that covered most of her hair, and sturdy leather shoes that had been resoled more than once. Frau Trophir's background was unremarkable in every way that history has preserved. She was neither wealthy nor desperately poor, neither particularly young nor notably old. She lived in a modest home with her husband, whose occupation was probably one of the common trades that sustained the city's economy. Perhaps he was a baker or a carpenter, a leather worker or a blacksmith. The records do not tell us, and in truth, it hardly matters, because what was about to happen would have seemed equally impossible regardless of the family circumstances. The morning proceeded normally for several hours. Frau Trophir may have visited the market, selecting vegetables for the day's meals with the careful attention to price and quality that marked the wise housewife. She may have stopped to chat with neighbors, exchanging the small bits of news and gossip that formed the social fabric of neighborhood life. These conversations would have been conducted in the relaxed manner of people who had known each other for years, people whose lives intersected daily in dozens of small, unremarkable ways. But sometime around midday, as the sun climbed toward its highest point and the streets began to shimmer with heat, something changed. Witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly how it began, partly because the transformation was so gradual that at first it seemed like nothing more than an oddity, and partly because what they were seeing was so far outside their experience that they lacked the words to capture it accurately. It began, they said, with Frau Trophir's feet. She seemed to stumble slightly, as if she had caught her toe on an uneven cobblestone, but instead of regaining her balance and continuing on her way, she stumbled again, and then again. Her movements became rhythmic, her feet lifting and falling in a pattern that bore no resemblance to normal walking. Within minutes, what had started as apparent clumsiness had transformed into something that could only be called dancing. But this was not dancing as the people of Strasbourg understood it. This was not the controlled, ceremonial movements that accompanied weddings and festivals, not the careful steps that had been passed down through generations and performed only on appropriate occasions. This was something wild and uncontrolled, as if Frau Trophir's body had been seized by forces entirely beyond her conscious will. The first witnesses to gather around her assumed that she was having some sort of fit, perhaps brought on by the heat or by some medical condition unknown to them. They spoke to her gently, trying to understand what was wrong, but Frau Trophir seemed unable to respond coherently. Her eyes were open, and she appeared to be conscious, but when people addressed her directly, she gave no sign that she heard them. Her attention was focused entirely on the movements of her body, movements that grew more elaborate and energetic with each passing minute. As word spread through the neighborhood, more people came to see what was happening. By mid-afternoon, a substantial crowd had gathered, forming a loose circle around the dancing woman while maintaining a respectful distance. The onlookers spoke in hushed voices, speculating about what might be causing this strange behavior. Some suggested that Frau Trophir might be drunk, though no one could smell alcohol on her breath, and besides, her movements were too coordinated for someone in an intoxicated state. Others wondered if she might be experiencing some form of religious ecstasy. There were precedents for this kind of thing in Christian history. Stories of saints and mystics who had been overcome by divine inspiration and had expressed their spiritual experiences through physical movement. But those episodes were usually brief, lasting minutes rather than hours, and they typically occurred in religious settings, not in the middle of a public street on an ordinary Tuesday. As the hours passed, it became clear that whatever was happening to Frau Trophia was not going to resolve itself quickly. Her dancing continued without pause, her movements showing no sign of fatigue. Despite the physical exertion involved, she spun and leaped and swayed, her feet striking the cobblestones in complex rhythms that seemed to follow some internal music that only she could hear. Sweat poured from her face and soaked through her clothing, but she showed no inclination to rest or to seek shade from the increasingly intense afternoon sun. The crowd grew larger as the day wore on, drawing people from all corners of the city. Merchants abandoned their stores, craftsmen left their workshops, and housewives set aside their domestic duties to come and witness this unprecedented spectacle. They came not with the eagerness of people seeking entertainment, but with the quiet fascination of individuals confronted with something that challenged their understanding of the natural world. Local authorities began to take notice as well. Members of the city council, men accustomed to dealing with practical problems like trade disputes and property boundaries, found themselves faced with a situation for which their experience provided no guidance. They observed Frau Trophy's condition with the same puzzled attention as everyone else, but they were no more able to explain what they were seeing than the humblest apprentice in the crowd. Religious leaders were summoned to offer their perspective. Parish priests, men trained in theology and experienced in ministering to troubled souls, examined the dancing woman with careful attention. They looked for signs of demonic possession, that explanation for inexplicable behavior that had served the church for centuries. But Frau Trophia showed none of the traditional symptoms. She did not speak in tongues or utter blasphemies. She did not recoil from holy symbols or react with violence to sacred words. She simply danced, as if dancing were the most natural thing in the world. Medical practitioners were consulted as well, though their knowledge was limited by the scientific understanding of the early 16th century. They examined Frau Trophia as best they could without interrupting her movements, checking her pulse and observing the color of her skin and the clarity of her eyes. They found her physically healthy in every respect they could determine, with no obvious signs of illness or injury that might explain her condition. As evening approached, the crowd began to thin somewhat, as people needed to return to their homes and families. But many remained, unwilling to leave without seeing some resolution to the mystery. They brought food and water, which Frau Trophia accepted gratefully during brief moments when her dancing slowed enough to allow it. But she consumed these provisions quickly and returned immediately to her rhythmic movements. The sun set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple, and still Frau Trophia danced. Torches were brought to provide light, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the surrounding buildings, and giving the entire scene an otherworldly quality. The dancing woman seemed almost spectral in this uncertain light, her movements taking on an ethereal quality that made some observers wonder if they were witnessing something supernatural. Night fell completely, and the crowd dwindled to a few dozen dedicated watchers. These were mostly neighbors and friends of the Trophia family, people who felt a personal responsibility to keep vigil over someone they knew and cared about. They took turns staying alert, ensuring that Frau Trophia was safe and that someone would be there to help if her condition suddenly changed. But her condition did not change. Through the long hours of the night, as the city around her settled into sleep, Frau Trophia continued to dance. Her movements were slower now, less energetic than they had been during the heat of the day, but they were no less continuous. She seemed to exist in a world of her own, a world where the normal rules of physical limitation and social behavior simply did not apply. Dawn came, painting the eastern horizon in pale pink and gold. And still the dancing continued. The few people who had maintained their vigil through the night were joined by early risers who had heard about the previous day's events and had come to see if the stories were true. They found Frau Troffea still moving to her internal rhythm, her face serene despite the obvious exhaustion that must have been building in her body. This was how it began on an ordinary summer morning in 1518, with one woman's inexplicable compulsion to dance. None of the witnesses could have imagined that what they were seeing was not an isolated incident, but rather the first symptom of a phenomenon that would soon spread through their city like ripples spreading across a pond. They could not have known that Frau Troffe's solitary dance was about to become something much larger and more disturbing, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about human nature and the boundaries of the possible. For now, they simply watched and wondered, trying to make sense of something that seemed to exist beyond the realm of sense. They offered what comfort and assistance they could, and they waited to see what tomorrow would bring, never suspecting that tomorrow would bring wonders and terrors beyond their wildest imagination. The second day of Frau Troffe's dancing dawned with a peculiar stillness that seemed to hang over the city like morning mist. Word of the previous day's extraordinary events had spread through Strasbourg's neighborhoods with the quiet efficiency that characterizes the transmission of truly remarkable news. People woke that morning with an unusual sense of anticipation, not the excited energy that accompanies a festival, but rather the subdued curiosity that comes when the familiar world reveals an unexpected mystery. By mid-morning, a steady stream of visitors had begun to make their way to the street where Frau Troffe continued her relentless dance. They came from all quarters of the city, merchants taking a break from their morning trade, craftsmen pausing in their work, housewives who had completed their early chores and could spare time for investigation. They arrived in small groups, speaking in low voices about what they expected to find, most of them half convinced that the stories they had heard were exaggerated, or that the dancing woman would have returned to normal by now. But Frau Troffea had not returned to normal. If anything, her condition seemed to have intensified during the night hours. Her movements had acquired a fluidity and complexity that suggested not exhaustion, but rather a deepening of whatever force was driving her. She spun and swayed with an almost supernatural grace, her feet finding intricate patterns on the cobblestones, while her arms moved in sweeping gestures that seemed to trace invisible shapes in the air around her. The crowd that gathered that morning was larger than the one from the previous day, but it maintained the same quality of respectful attention. These were not spectators seeking entertainment, but rather witnesses to something that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of normal experience. They watched with the focused concentration of people trying to understand a language they had never heard before, searching for clues that might help them make sense of what they were seeing. It was around noon, when the summer sun had climbed high enough to cast short shadows, and the morning's coolness had given way to genuine warmth, that the first of the others began to dance. Her name, if it was ever recorded, has been lost to history, but witnesses described her as a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd for the better part of an hour. She had seemed as puzzled and concerned as everyone else, speaking quietly with her neighbors and occasionally shaking her head in bewilderment at Frau Troffe's continued movements. The transformation, when it came, was as sudden and inexplicable as Frau Troffe's had been the day before. The young woman's body seemed to twitch just once, as if she had been startled by some unexpected sound, but instead of looking around to see what had disturbed her, she twitched again, and then again. Within moments, her feet were moving in the same rhythmic patterns that had characterized Frau Troffe's dance, and her arms were beginning to trace similar arcs through the warm afternoon air. The crowd reacted with a mixture of fascination and alarm that rippled through the gathered observers like wind through a field of grain. Some people pressed closer, as if proximity might help them understand what was happening, while others stepped back, perhaps sensing that whatever was occurring might somehow be contagious. Voices rose in confusion and concern as people tried to comprehend the fact that they were no longer witnessing an isolated incident, but rather something that appeared to be spreading from person to person. The two women danced near each other, but not quite together, each following her own internal rhythm while maintaining an awareness of the other's movements. They seemed to exist in a shared but separate space, connected by their common compulsion, but isolated within their individual experiences of it. Neither appeared to be imitating the other consciously. Rather, they both seemed to be responding to the same invisible force, the same unheard music that was compelling their bodies to move in ways that their minds might never have chosen. By the middle of the afternoon, a third dancer had joined them. This was a man in his 30s, a blacksmith, judging by the burns on his hands and the muscular development of his arms and shoulders. He had been among the most vocal of the observers, speculating loudly about possible explanations for the women's behavior and suggesting practical solutions that might bring them back to their senses. But his confident analysis was interrupted when his own body began to betray him, his feet starting to move in the now familiar patterns despite his obvious efforts to control them. The sight of a strong, rational man succumbing to the same mysterious compulsion that had affected the two women sent a deeper chill through the assembled crowd. If this thing, whatever it was, could overcome someone as physically powerful and mentally strong as a blacksmith, then perhaps no one was safe from its influence. Parents began to pull their children closer, while some adults started to edge away from the growing circle of dancers, uncertain whether distance would provide any protection but unwilling to take chances. As the day progressed, more individuals began to exhibit the telltale signs of the spreading contagion. A baker's wife who had come to see what all the commotion was about found her feet tapping to rhythms that existed only in her mind. A young apprentice, barely out of childhood, began to sway in place while his master called his name with increasing urgency. An elderly man who had lived through more than 7 decades of ordinary life discovered that his aged limbs were capable of movements he had never imagined possible. Each new case followed the same pattern, a period of normal behavior, during which the person seemed no different from any other curious observer, followed by the sudden onset of uncontrollable rhythmic movement. There was no apparent logic to who was affected and who was not. The dancers came from all social classes and age groups, with no obvious common characteristics except for their presence in the vicinity of the original incident. Some of the afflicted seemed distressed by their condition, their faces showing confusion and fear as they found themselves unable to control their own movements. Others appeared almost serene, as if they had accepted their situation and were finding some form of satisfaction or release in their continuous motion. But all of them continued to dance, their movements growing more elaborate and coordinated as the hours passed, as if practice was making them more skilled at expressing whatever inner compulsion was driving them. The local authorities, who had been monitoring the situation since its inception, found themselves facing a crisis unlike anything in their experience or training. The city council convened an emergency meeting to discuss what should be done about the growing number of dancers, but their deliberations were hampered by the simple fact that no one had any idea what they were dealing with. Was this a medical condition that could be treated? A supernatural phenomenon that required religious intervention? A form of mass hysteria that might resolve itself if left alone? Religious leaders were called upon to offer their guidance and expertise. They examined the dancers carefully, looking for signs that might indicate whether this was a manifestation of divine will, demonic influence, or simple human madness. They found the dancers to be lucid when spoken to directly, capable of understanding questions and even providing brief answers, though their responses often seemed distant and distracted, as if their attention were focused primarily on internal sensations rather than external communication. Medical practitioners were consulted as well, though their diagnostic tools were limited by the scientific knowledge of their time. They observed the dancers' physical condition, noting that despite the continuous exertion, most seemed to be in remarkably good health. Their pulses were elevated but steady, their breathing was deep and regular, and their coordination appeared to be improving rather than deteriorating as fatigue set in. As evening approached, the number of active dancers had grown to more than a dozen, with new cases appearing every few hours. The street that had been the site of Frau Trophy's solitary performance was now filled with moving bodies, creating a scene that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. The dancers moved independently, but in a strange kind of harmony, as if they were all hearing the same distant orchestra and interpreting its music through their individual movements. The crowd of observers had grown as well, but its character had changed from curious interest to something approaching fearful fascination. People came to see the dancers, but kept their distance, forming a wide circle around the affected area and speaking in whispers as if afraid that loud voices might somehow trigger their own involvement in the mysterious epidemic. Night fell, and torches were once again brought to illuminate the scene. In the flickering light, the dancers took on an even more otherworldly appearance, their shadows stretching and contracting across the cobblestones in patterns that seemed to have their own choreographic logic. Some of the afflicted appeared to draw energy from the darkness, their movements becoming more vigorous as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged overhead. The city settled into an uneasy sleep that night, with many residents lying awake in their beds and wondering whether the morning would bring an end to the strange outbreak or an expansion of it. Parents checked on their children more frequently than usual, while spouses held each other closer, as if physical contact might provide some protection against the inexplicable force that was transforming their neighbors into creatures of endless motion. In the streets where the dancers continued their relentless performance, a few dedicated watchers maintained their vigil, documenting the progress of the epidemic and ensuring that the affected individuals had access to water and whatever food they could consume while in motion. These guardians spoke little, awed into silence by the magnitude of what they were witnessing and uncertain whether they were observing a tragedy or miracle. The contagion was spreading, that much was clear, but its ultimate destination and duration remained as mysterious as its origin. What had begun as one woman's inexplicable compulsion to dance had become a phenomenon that threatened to engulf an entire community, transforming the peaceful streets of Strasbourg into a stage for one of history's most puzzling performances. Dawn broke on the third day of what was already being called the dancing sickness, with an orange glow that painted the medieval spires of Strasbourg in warm, deceptive light. The contrast between the peaceful beauty of the sunrise and the chaotic reality unfolding in the city's streets created an atmosphere of surreal tension that seemed to hang in the morning air, like incense in a cathedral. As the first light touched the cobblestones where the dancers continued their relentless performance, it illuminated a scene that would have been unimaginable just days before. The number of affected individuals had continued to grow throughout the night, and by morning, nearly 30 people were lost in their rhythmic movements. They filled the original street and had begun to spill into adjacent areas, creating a slowly expanding zone of constant motion that pulsed with an energy that was both magnetic and deeply unsettling. The dancers ranged in age from children barely old enough to walk steadily to elderly individuals whose aged joints somehow found the strength and flexibility for movements that would have been impressive in people half their age. The city council, faced with a crisis that had no precedent in their collective memory or institutional knowledge, convened an emergency session as soon as the morning bells had finished ringing. These were practical men, merchants and guild leaders who had built their careers on understanding cause and effect, on finding rational solutions to concrete problems. But the dancing sickness presented them with a situation that seemed to exist outside the realm of rational explanation, and their usual methods of analysis and decision-making felt inadequate to the task. The meeting took place in the council chamber, a room lined with dark wood paneling and lit by tall windows that looked out over the city. The morning light that streamed through these windows illuminated the faces of men who were struggling to maintain their composure while discussing events that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about human behavior and social order. They spoke in measured tones about practical matters, the disruption to commerce, the need to maintain public safety, the growing concern among the citizenry, while carefully avoiding any direct discussion of the deeper implications of what they were witnessing. Master Heinrich Weber, the senior guild representative, and a man whose family had lived in Strasbourg for 6 generations, opened the discussion with a summary of the situation as he understood it. He spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing his words with the care of someone who recognized that his statements would be recorded and remembered. The dancing sickness, he explained, had begun with a single individual and had spread to affect dozens of citizens from all walks of life. The affected persons appeared to be physically healthy, but were unable to control their compulsive movements. No treatment attempted thus far had shown any effect, and the number of cases continued to increase daily. The council members listened to this summary with the grave attention of men who understood that they were dealing with something that could potentially threaten the stability of their entire community. Strasbourg was a prosperous trading city, dependent on its reputation for order and reliability. Merchants from throughout the Holy Roman Empire came there to conduct business because they knew they could expect fair treatment and predictable conditions. But how could trade continue normally when the streets were filled with people who seemed to have lost control of their most basic functions? Master Johann Kleist, representing the Merchants' Guild, raised concerns about the economic impact of the crisis. Already, he reported, visitors to the city were asking questions about the strange scenes they witnessed in the streets. Some had expressed reluctance to conduct business in a place where such inexplicable events were occurring. If word spread to other trading centers that Strasbourg was experiencing some form of plague or supernatural visitation, it could seriously damage the city's commercial relationships and financial prosperity. The religious implications of the crisis were addressed by Father Andreas Metz, the senior priest of the cathedral and an unofficial advisor to the council on matters involving the church. He spoke with the measured authority of a man who had spent decades studying theology and ministering to the spiritual needs of the community. The dancing sickness, he explained, did not fit the traditional patterns associated with demonic possession or divine punishment. The affected individual showed no signs of spiritual distress, no aversion to holy symbols or sacred words, no utterance of blasphemies or foreign languages. Father Metz suggested that the phenomenon might be understood as a form of religious enthusiasm, similar to the ecstatic dancing that had been reported in other parts of Europe during times of spiritual revival. Perhaps, he theorized, the people of Strasbourg were experiencing a collective outpouring of religious feeling, a spontaneous expression of faith that manifested itself through physical movement rather than through conventional prayer or worship. This interpretation was received with some relief by the council members, as it suggested that the dancing sickness might be a benign or even positive development rather than a sign of divine displeasure or supernatural malevolence. If the dancers were indeed expressing religious devotion through their movements, then the appropriate response would be to provide them with spiritual support and guidance rather than to treat them as victims of some unknown malady. Dr. Sebastian Brenner, one of the few university-trained physicians in the city, offered a different perspective based on his medical knowledge and experience. He had examined several of the dancers and found them to be in remarkably good physical condition, considering the continuous exertion they were undergoing. Their pulses were elevated but regular, their breathing was deep and controlled, and their coordination appeared to be improving rather than deteriorating with time. Dr. Brenner theorized that the dancing sickness might be a form of natural therapy, a way for the human body to address some underlying imbalance or disorder through rhythmic movement. He pointed to ancient medical traditions that used dance and music as healing tools, suggesting that what they were witnessing might be an instinctive response by the body to restore harmony and health. This medical interpretation, like the religious one, offered the comfort of suggesting that the phenomenon might be beneficial rather than harmful. However, not all members of the council were convinced by these relatively optimistic explanations. Master Wilhelm Faust, whose family had been involved in city governance for more than a century, expressed concern about the potential for the situation to spiral out of control. If the dancing sickness continued to spread at its current rate, he calculated, it could affect hundreds or even thousands of citizens within a matter of weeks. Even if the condition was ultimately harmless, the social and economic disruption caused by having such a large portion of the population unable to work or fulfill their normal responsibilities could be catastrophic. The council spent several hours debating various courses of action, each proposal reflecting different assumptions about the nature and likely progression of the crisis. Some members favored a cautious approach, arguing that they should wait to see whether the phenomenon would resolve itself naturally. Others advocated for more active intervention, though they disagreed about what form such intervention should take. Eventually, a consensus emerged around a multifaceted response that would address both the immediate practical needs of the situation and the longer-term concerns about public health and social stability. The council decided to establish a coordinated effort involving religious, medical, and civic authorities, each working within their area of expertise to understand and manage the crisis. The religious component of the response would be led by Father Metz and the other priests of the city's churches. They would provide spiritual support to the dancers and their families, offering prayers and blessings that might help to resolve the situation if it were indeed a manifestation of religious enthusiasm. They would also organize special services and processions intended to channel any collective spiritual energy in more conventional directions. The medical component would be overseen by Dr. Brenner and his colleagues, who would continue to monitor the physical health of the affected individuals and would experiment with various treatments that might restore them to normal behavior. They would also study the pattern of the disease's spread, looking for clues that might help them understand its course and predict its likely course. The civic component would focus on maintaining public order and ensuring that the basic functions of the city continue to operate despite the disruption caused by the dancing sickness. This would involve providing food and water to the dancers, managing the crowds of observers, and coordinating with neighboring communities to prevent the spread of panic or misinformation about conditions in Strasbourg. As the council meeting concluded, the members felt a measure of relief at having developed what seemed like a rational and comprehensive response to an irrational and unprecedented situation. They had taken action, which gave them a sense of control over events that had previously seemed completely beyond their influence. But beneath their professional confidence, each man carried private doubts about whether their carefully planned response would prove adequate to address whatever forces were truly at work in their city. The implementation of the council's plan began immediately, with messengers dispatched to inform the various authorities of their new responsibilities and to coordinate the timing of their respective efforts. The priests began preparing special liturgies and organizing prayer vigils, while the physicians started gathering supplies for their planned treatments and interventions. The civic authorities initiated the practical arrangements necessary to support a potentially large population of individuals who would need care but might be unable to care for themselves. As these preparations got underway, the dancing continued in the streets, seemingly oblivious to the official response that was being organized around it. The dancers moved with undiminished energy, their bodies tracing patterns that grew more complex and elaborate with each passing hour. To the trained observers who had been watching since the beginning, it seemed that the afflicted individuals were developing a kind of collective choreography, their individual movements beginning to harmonize with those of their fellow dancers in ways that suggested some form of unconscious coordination. The afternoon brought the first official attempts to intervene directly in the dancing phenomenon. Father Metz arrived with a group of assistant priests, carrying holy water and religious relics that had been blessed specifically for this purpose. They approached the dancers with the solemn dignity appropriate to a religious ceremony, chanting prayers in Latin while sprinkling holy water over the moving figures. The dancers seemed aware of the religious intervention, but showed no particular reaction to it. They neither recoiled from the holy water, nor showed signs of spiritual relief or awakening. Instead, they continued their movements with the same steady intensity they had maintained since their individual afflictions had begun. Some even seemed to incorporate the presence of the priests into their dancing, moving around them in spirals and circles that created an impromptu religious procession of sorts. Dr. Brenner's medical intervention followed shortly afterward. He and 2 colleagues attempted to examine the dancers more thoroughly, checking their pulses and temperatures while trying to determine whether there were any physical abnormalities that might explain their condition. They brought with them various herbal remedies and tinctures that were commonly used to treat disorders of the nervous system and mental disturbances. The medical examination revealed that the dancers were indeed in remarkable physical condition. Their heart rates were elevated but steady, their skin was warm and healthy, and their eyes were clear and bright. When spoken to directly, most could respond coherently, though their answers were often brief and seemed to require considerable effort to produce. It was as if their primary attention was focused on some internal experience that left little mental capacity for external communication. The herbal treatments proved no more effective than the religious interventions. The dancers accepted the offered medicines willingly enough, but the substances seemed to have no impact on their compulsive movements. Even remedies that normally produce drowsiness or relaxation had no visible effect, as if whatever was driving the dancing was operating at a level deeper than conventional medical treatments could reach. By evening, the council's carefully planned response had produced detailed documentation of the phenomenon, but no actual progress in resolving it. The number of active dancers had continued to increase throughout the day, and the affected area had expanded to encompass several city blocks. What had begun as a localized curiosity was clearly evolving into a citywide crisis that would require more dramatic intervention if it were to be brought under control. The council reconvened as darkness fell, their earlier confidence somewhat dampened by the day's lack of success. The reports from the religious and medical authorities painted a picture of a phenomenon that seemed to exist beyond the reach of conventional understanding or treatment. The dancers appeared to be healthy and content, but they were also completely unable to control their actions, creating a paradox that challenged every framework the authorities possessed for understanding human behavior. It was during this evening session that Master Faust made the suggestion that would ultimately shape the city's response to the crisis for the weeks to come. If conventional treatments were proving ineffective, he argued, perhaps they needed to consider more unconventional approaches. Since the dancers seemed to be driven by some form of internal music, perhaps the solution was to provide them with external music that might somehow satisfy or redirect their compulsion. This suggestion was met with initial skepticism from several council members, who wondered whether providing music for the dancers might actually encourage the spread of the condition to additional victims. But Father Metz pointed out that many religious traditions use music and dance as forms of worship, suggesting that there might be precedent for addressing spiritual conditions through rhythmic expression. Dr. Brenner added that some medical authorities had written about the therapeutic value of music in treating disorders of the mind and spirit. After considerable debate, the council decided to authorize a carefully controlled experiment in musical intervention. They would hire professional musicians to play for the dancers, reasoning that skilled performers might be able to provide the kind of musical structure that could potentially guide the afflicted individuals back toward normal behavior. The musicians would be instructed to begin with rhythms that match the dancer's current movements, and then gradually slow the tempo, hoping to draw the dancers into a more controlled and eventually stationary state. The decision to employ musicians represented a significant shift in the city's approach to the crisis. Instead of treating the dancing as a problem to be eliminated, they were beginning to treat it as a phenomenon to be managed and directed. This philosophical change reflected a growing recognition that the dancing sickness might not respond to conventional forms of intervention, and that more creative approaches might be necessary. As the third day of the crisis came to an end, the city of Strasbourg had been transformed in ways that its citizens were still struggling to comprehend. The careful routines that had governed daily life for generations had been disrupted by forces that seemed to operate according to entirely different rules. The response from the authorities had been prompt and well organized, but it had also revealed the limitations of traditional knowledge and institutional authority when confronted with truly unprecedented events. The stage was now set for an experiment in musical intervention that would either provide a solution to the crisis or demonstrate once and for all that the dancing sickness was beyond human power to control. The musicians were summoned, the instruments prepared, and the entire city waited to see whether the ancient power of music might succeed where medicine and religion had failed. The morning of the fourth day brought Dr. Sebastian Brenner to his study earlier than usual, the pale light of dawn filtering through the small windows of his modest home as he spread out the notes and observations he had been collecting since the dancing sickness began. As one of the few university-trained physicians in Strasbourg, he felt the weight of expectation from both the city council and the community at large, all of whom hoped that his medical knowledge might provide answers to questions that seemed to exist beyond the realm of rational explanation. Dr. Brenner's education had taken place at the University of Heidelberg, where he had studied the classical medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen, alongside more recent works by Arabic physicians whose knowledge had been preserved and transmitted through centuries of careful scholarship. His training had taught him to observe symptoms methodically, to consider multiple possible causes for any given condition, and to prescribe treatments based on established principles of medical theory. But nothing in his formal education had prepared him for a phenomenon like the dancing sickness that was currently affecting his city. He began his morning examination of his notes by reviewing the physical symptoms he had observed in the affected individuals. The dancers showed elevated heart rates and increased respiration, which was to be expected given the continuous physical exertion they were undergoing. Their skin was warm and slightly flushed, again consistent with prolonged exercise. Their pupils were normal in size and reactive to light, suggesting that their nervous systems were functioning properly. Their reflexes were normal. Their coordination was actually improved from what he had observed in the same individuals before their affliction, and their apparent stamina was far beyond what he would have expected from people engaged in such strenuous activity. Most puzzling of all was the dancers' mental state. When examined individually, away from the group, they appeared to be completely lucid and rational. They could answer questions appropriately. They recognized family members and friends, and they seemed to understand their situation clearly. But when asked why they continued to dance, they offered explanations that were both consistent and deeply unsatisfying. They spoke of feeling compelled to move, of hearing music that others could not hear, of experiencing a sense of inner harmony that depended on the continuation of their rhythmic movements. Dr. Brenner had consulted every medical text in his possession, searching for precedents that might help him understand what he was witnessing. The ancient Greek physicians had written about conditions involving uncontrollable movement, but these were typically described as brief episodes associated with severe mental illness or demonic possession. The Arabic medical authorities had documented cases of mass hysteria, but these usually involved symptoms like fainting or convulsions rather than coordinated dance-like movements. The closest parallels he could find were in texts dealing with religious ecstasy and mystical experiences. Several medieval physicians had written about individuals who became lost in prayer or meditation, entering states of consciousness that seemed to transcend normal awareness while maintaining physical health and basic mental function. But even these cases were typically individual experiences lasting hours or days at most, not collective phenomena that could persist for weeks or months. As Dr. Brenner pondered these precedents, he found himself drawn toward a theory that combined elements from various medical traditions while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of what he was observing. He theorized that the dancing sickness might represent a form of collective therapeutic response, a way for the human body and mind to address imbalances or disorders that conventional treatments had failed to resolve. This theory was based on his observation that many of the affected individuals had been suffering from various ailments before the dancing began. Frau Troffer, the first to be afflicted, had been known to suffer from periodic episodes of melancholy and lethargy that had persisted for months despite various treatments. Several of the other early dancers had similarly been struggling with conditions that medieval medicine classified as disorders of the humors, an excess of black bile leading to depression, an imbalance of blood causing restlessness and agitation, or a predominance of phlegm resulting in sluggishness and mental fog. Could it be, Dr. Brenner wondered, that the dancing represented an attempt by the body to restore proper balance through vigorous movement? The continuous physical activity would certainly help to redistribute the bodily humours, while the apparent mental satisfaction experienced by the dancers suggested that some form of healing was indeed taking place. This would explain why conventional treatments had proven ineffective. They were attempting to stop a process that was actually beneficial, like trying to prevent a fever from breaking or interfering with the natural healing of a wound. To test this theory, Dr. Brenner began a systematic examination of the medical histories of all the affected individuals. He interviewed family members and friends, consulted with other physicians who had treated these patients, and reviewed any written records that existed regarding their previous health conditions. What he discovered provided substantial support for his hypothesis about the therapeutic nature of the dancing sickness. Nearly every one of the dancers had indeed been suffering from chronic ailments that had resisted conventional treatment. The young woman who had been the second to be affected had been struggling with persistent headaches and dizzy spells that had prevented her from working regularly for more than a year. The blacksmith had been experiencing joint pain and stiffness that had been gradually limiting his ability to perform his trade. An elderly merchant had been plagued by insomnia and digestive problems that had made his life increasingly miserable, despite the efforts of several physicians. Most remarkably, according to their families, all of these pre-existing conditions seemed to have disappeared or dramatically improved since the dancing began. The young woman's headaches were gone, the blacksmith's joints moved with fluid ease, and the elderly merchant appeared to be sleeping soundly during the brief periods when exhaustion temporarily overcame his compulsion to dance. It was as if the continuous movement was indeed serving some form of therapeutic function, addressing underlying health problems through mechanisms that conventional medicine did not understand. Dr. Brenner's colleague, Master Johann Waldman, arrived at the study shortly after midday to review these findings and to contribute his own observations. Waldman was an older physician whose practice relied more on traditional folk remedies and herbal treatments than on university training, but his decades of experience treating the ailments of common people gave him insights that complemented Dr. Brenner's theoretical knowledge. Master Waldman had been particularly struck by the apparent improvement in the mental state of the dancers. Before their affliction, many of them had shown signs of what he called spiritual sickness, a condition characterized by despair, anxiety, and a sense of disconnection from their community and their faith. But as dancers, these same individuals seemed peaceful and content, their faces showing a serenity that he had rarely observed in his years of medical practice. This observation led the two physicians to consider whether the dancing sickness might have a spiritual as well as a physical component. Perhaps, they theorized, the continuous movement served not only to rebalance the bodily humors, but also to reconnect the dancers with some deeper source of meaning and purpose. This would explain why religious interventions had proven ineffective. The dancers were already experiencing a form of spiritual healing that transcended conventional religious practices. The spiritual dimension of their theory was supported by reports from observers who had spent extended periods watching the dancers. Several witnesses had commented on the apparent communication that seemed to occur between the affected individuals, despite the fact that they rarely spoke to each other directly. They seemed to respond to each other's movements, creating complex group patterns that emerged spontaneously without any apparent leadership or coordination. This suggested to Dr. Brenner and Master Wardman that the dancers might be experiencing a form of collective consciousness, a shared awareness that allowed them to function as a unified organism while maintaining their individual identities. Such phenomena had been reported in various mystical and religious traditions, but the physicians were unaware of any previous cases where this kind of consciousness had manifested through continuous physical movement. As the afternoon progressed, the two physicians developed their theory into a comprehensive explanation for the dancing sickness that addressed both its immediate symptoms and its broader implications. They proposed that the phenomenon represented a form of natural therapy that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: physical, mental, and spiritual. The continuous movement served to rebalance bodily humors, while the collective experience provided a sense of community and purpose that addressed underlying psychological needs. According to this theory, the dancing sickness would continue until the therapeutic process was complete, at which point the affected individuals would naturally return to normal behavior, presumably cured of their original ailments. Attempts to interrupt the process through external intervention would not only be ineffective, but might actually be harmful, preventing the completion of a healing process that the body and mind had initiated in response to conditions that conventional medicine had been unable to address. This therapeutic interpretation of the dancing sickness had profound implications for how the authorities should respond to the crisis. If the physicians were correct, then the appropriate course of action was not to try to stop the dancing, but rather to support and facilitate it, ensuring that the dancers remained healthy and safe while the healing process ran its course. This would mean providing adequate nutrition and hydration, protecting the dancers from injury or harassment, and perhaps most importantly, resisting the urge to interfere with a natural process that was ultimately beneficial. Dr. Brenner and Master Wardman spent the remainder of the day preparing a formal report of their findings and recommendations for presentation to the City Council. They knew that their theory would be controversial, as it challenged conventional assumptions about disease and treatment while proposing a relatively passive response to what appeared to be a serious public health crisis. But they were convinced that their analysis was correct, and that acting on it offered the best hope for both resolving the immediate situation and advancing medical understanding of conditions that had previously been considered beyond the reach of rational explanation. As evening approached, the two physicians made their way through the streets toward the council chambers, passing close to the areas where the dancers continued their relentless movements. The number of affected individuals had continued to grow, and the complexity of their collective choreography had become even more elaborate. Watching them move in their intricate patterns, Dr. Brenner felt a deep conviction that he was witnessing not a disease but a cure, not a breakdown of human function, but rather an expression of healing wisdom that conventional medicine was only beginning to understand. The presentation to the council would be crucial in determining whether this interpretation would be accepted and whether the city's response would shift from attempted intervention to supportive facilitation. The physicians carried with them not only their medical analysis, but also their faith in the body's innate wisdom, their belief that sometimes the most rational response to an apparently irrational phenomenon is to trust in processes that exist beyond the current boundaries of human understanding. Father Andries Metz had spent most of the sleepless hours before dawn in the cathedral's private chapel, kneeling before the carved wooden crucifix that had watched over the spiritual needs of Strasbourg citizens for more than 2 centuries. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, an ironic reminder of the very phenomenon that had brought him to seek divine guidance at such an early hour. As the senior priest of the city's most important church, he carried the weight of expectation from both the civil authorities and his congregation, all of whom hoped that his theological training might provide insights into events that seemed to exist at the intersection of the natural and supernatural worlds. Father Metz's education had taken place at the University of Paris, where he had studied the works of Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and other great theologians who had grappled with the relationship between divine will and human experience. His training had prepared him to recognize signs of spiritual significance, to distinguish between authentic religious experiences and mere superstition, and to guide souls through crises of faith and understanding. But the dancing sickness presented him with phenomena that seemed to blur the lines between all the categories his theological education had taught him to keep distinct. The morning light gradually filled the chapel as Father Metz continued his meditation, seeking clarity about the proper spiritual interpretation of events that had no clear precedent in Christian tradition. He had consulted every theological text in the cathedral's library, searching for guidance about how to understand collective episodes of uncontrollable movement. What he had found was a complex tapestry of possibilities, each supported by different aspects of Christian doctrine and historical experience. One possible interpretation was that the dancing represented a form of divine punishment, a visible manifestation of God's displeasure with the spiritual condition of the city. This interpretation had strong biblical precedent, as the Old Testament contained numerous examples of divine judgment expressed through physical afflictions that affected entire communities. The plagues that had befallen Egypt, the diseases that had struck the Israelites during their periods of disobedience, and the various calamities that had befallen cities that had turned away from God's will, all provided models for understanding collective suffering as a form of spiritual correction. But Father Metz found this interpretation difficult to reconcile with his observations of the actual dancers. Unlike the victims of divine punishment described in biblical accounts, the affected individuals seemed peaceful and content rather than tormented or distressed. Their faces showed serenity rather than anguish, and their movements, while compulsive, appeared to bring them satisfaction rather than suffering. This did not match the pattern of divine punishment as traditionally understood within Christian theology. A second possible interpretation was that the dancing represented a form of demonic possession, a collective invasion of evil spirits that had somehow gained control over the bodies and wills of multiple individuals. This explanation had the advantage of accounting for the supernatural aspects of the phenomenon while providing a clear framework for understanding what needed to be done. The demons would need to be exorcised through prayer, fasting, and the application of sacred rituals designed to drive out evil influences. Father Metz had performed several exorcisms during his career as a priest, and he was familiar with the traditional signs of demonic possession. But here again, the dancers did not conform to established patterns. They showed no aversion to holy symbols or sacred words. They did not speak in tongues or utter blasphemies, and they did not exhibit the violent resistance to religious intervention that characterized authentic cases of possession. When approached with holy water and blessed objects, they remained calm and accepting, showing neither the fear nor the rage that demons were known to display when confronted with sacred power. The third interpretation that Father Metz considered was that the dancing might represent a form of divine inspiration, a manifestation of the Holy Spirit working through human bodies to express spiritual truths that could not be communicated through conventional means. This possibility was supported by numerous examples from Christian history of saints and mystics who had experienced ecstatic states that involved unusual physical manifestations. The medieval period in particular had seen many cases of religious figures who entered trance-like states during which they performed actions that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. This interpretation was appealing because it suggested that the dancing might actually be a positive spiritual development, a sign that God was working in a special way within the community of Strasbourg. It would explain why the dancers appeared content and peaceful, why their movements seemed to follow patterns of harmony and beauty, and why they showed no resistance to religious symbols or practices. If the Holy Spirit were indeed working through their bodies, then the appropriate response would be to support and celebrate the phenomenon rather than to try to stop it. However, Father Metz was also aware of the dangers inherent into readily accepting claims of divine inspiration. The Church's history included many examples of false prophets and deluded individuals who had convinced themselves and others that their unusual behavior was divinely motivated. The challenge for any priest was to distinguish between authentic spiritual experiences and mere enthusiasm or self-deception, a task that required careful observation, theological knowledge, and considerable spiritual discernment. As the morning progressed and the cathedral began to fill with parishioners arriving for the daily service, Father Metz found himself drawn toward a fourth interpretation that synthesized elements from the other three, while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of what was occurring. Perhaps, he thought, the dancing sickness represented a form of spiritual crisis that required a new kind of theological understanding, one that recognized the complexity of God's relationship with human communities and the variety of ways in which divine will might manifest itself in the world. This interpretation suggested that the dancing might be simultaneously a sign of spiritual distress and a means of spiritual healing, a collective cry for help that contained within itself the seeds of resolution. The people of Strasbourg, faced with challenges and anxieties that they could not address through normal means, might be experiencing a form of spiritual catharsis that allowed them to release tensions and fears that had been building within the community for months or years. Father Metz had observed that many of the dancers were individuals who had been struggling with various forms of personal difficulty before their affliction began. Some had lost family members to disease or accident. Others had faced financial hardship or social isolation, and still others had been wrestling with questions of faith and meaning that had left them feeling disconnected from their religious community. Perhaps the dancing represented a way for these troubled souls to reconnect with sources of spiritual strength and communal support that conventional religious practices had failed to provide. This interpretation was supported by his observation of the dancers' behavior during religious services, rather than avoiding the church or showing discomfort in its presence. Several of the affected individuals had actually been drawn to participate in worship, incorporating their continuous movements into the rhythm of prayers and hymns in ways that seemed to deepen rather than disrupt the spiritual atmosphere of the service. Their dancing had become a form of prayer, their movements a physical expression of devotion that complemented rather than competed with traditional forms of worship. During the morning service, Father Metz addressed his congregation about the dancing sickness for the first time, offering them a theological framework for understanding events that had been causing considerable anxiety and confusion within the community. He spoke carefully and thoughtfully, acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the phenomenon while providing reassurance that it could be understood within the context of Christian faith and experience. He reminded his listeners that God worked in mysterious ways, often using events that seemed strange or disturbing to human understanding to accomplish divine purposes that would only become clear with the passage of time. The dancing sickness, he suggested, might be one of these mysterious workings of divine providence, a phenomenon that challenged human assumptions about the proper relationship between body and spirit, individual and community, earthly and heavenly concerns. Father Metz encouraged his parishioners to respond to the dancers with compassion and understanding rather than fear or judgment. If the phenomenon were indeed a manifestation of spiritual crisis and healing, then the appropriate Christian response was to offer support and prayer for those who were affected, trusting that God would bring good out of what appeared to be a disturbing situation. He also announced that he would be organizing special prayer services and religious processions designed to provide spiritual support for the entire community during this time of uncertainty. These services would include prayers for the dancers' well-being and for divine guidance in understanding the meaning of the events that were unfolding in their city. The entire community would be invited to participate, regardless of whether they had been directly affected by the dancing sickness. The response to Father Metz's sermon was largely positive, with many parishioners expressing relief at having a theological framework for understanding events that had seemed to exist beyond the reach of rational explanation. Several approached him after the service to share their own observations about the dancers and to seek additional guidance about how they should respond to family members or neighbors who had been affected. One elderly woman, whose daughter had been among the early dancers, told Father Metz that she had initially been terrified by her daughter's condition, but had gradually come to see it as a form of spiritual awakening. Her daughter, who had been withdrawn and melancholy for months following the death of her husband, seemed more at peace while dancing than she had been at any time since her bereavement. The mother wondered whether the continuous movement might be helping her daughter process her grief in ways that conventional mourning practices had failed to accomplish. A master craftsman shared similar observations about one of his apprentices who had joined the dancers several days earlier. The young man had been struggling with feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt that had been affecting his work and his relationships with his fellow workers. But since beginning to dance, he seemed more confident and serene, as if the physical movement had somehow resolved internal conflicts that had been troubling him for months. These and similar accounts convinced Father Metz that his interpretation of the dancing sickness as a form of spiritual crisis and healing was likely correct. The phenomenon appeared to be serving a therapeutic function, not just for individuals, but for the community as a whole, providing a means for people to address emotional and spiritual challenges that conventional religious practices had not adequately resolved. As the day progressed, Father Metz began planning the special religious services he had promised during his sermon. These would need to be carefully designed to provide spiritual support for the dancers, while also addressing the needs of the broader community. He envisioned processions that would move through the areas where the dancing was occurring, creating opportunities for the entire community to participate in prayer and worship while demonstrating acceptance and support for those who were affected. He also began working on a theological treatise that would provide a more detailed explanation of his interpretation of the dancing sickness for presentation to church authorities in other cities. If his analysis was correct, then the phenomenon in Strasbourg might be part of a broader pattern of spiritual renewal that could have implications for Christian communities throughout the region. By documenting his observations and interpretations, he hoped to contribute to a theological understanding that might help other priests and religious leaders respond appropriately to similar events should they occur elsewhere. As evening approached, Father Metz returned to the cathedral for evening prayers, passing through streets where the dancers continued their relentless movements under the light of torches and lanterns. Watching them move in their intricate patterns, he felt a deep sense of peace about his interpretation of their condition. Whether or not his theological analysis was entirely correct, he was convinced that the dancing represented a genuine spiritual phenomenon that deserved respect and support rather than fear and condemnation. The religious response to the dancing sickness would need to balance pastoral care for those directly affected with guidance and reassurance for the broader community. By providing a framework for understanding the phenomenon within Christian tradition, while remaining open to the possibility that God might be working in new and unprecedented ways, Father Metz hoped to help his community navigate through this mysterious time with faith and compassion intact. The call for musicians had gone out from the city council chambers on the evening of the fourth day, carried by mounted messengers who rode swiftly along the well-travelled roads that connected Strasbourg to the surrounding towns and villages. The summons was urgent, but carefully worded, requesting the immediate services of skilled performers who could play a variety of instruments, and who would be willing to participate in an unusual but well-compensated civic project. The messengers carried official documents bearing the city's seal, along with promises of generous payment and comfortable lodging for any musicians who could reach Strasbourg within 2 days. The response was swift and surprisingly enthusiastic. Word of the dancing sickness had already spread beyond the city's boundaries, carried by merchants and travellers who had witnessed the extraordinary scenes in Strasbourg streets. For professional musicians, who made their living by entertaining audiences with novel and remarkable performances, the opportunity to participate in such an unprecedented event was as appealing as the promised financial rewards. By the morning of the 6th day, more than 30 musicians had assembled in the city's main square, their wagons loaded with instruments of every description. There were drummers with deep-voiced timbales and sharp-voiced tabors, flutists with wooden pipes that could produce melodies as sweet as birdsong, and trumpeters whose brass instruments could cut through the loudest crowd noise. String players had brought lutes and viols, while several performers specialized in more exotic instruments, bagpipes from the northern regions, dulcimers from the eastern territories, and even a few instruments that the local citizens could not identify but which produced sounds of haunting beauty. The leader of this musical assembly was Master Hans Keller, a man whose reputation as both a performer and a composer had spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire. He was a stout, jovial figure in his 50s, with calloused fingers that spoke of decades spent coaxing music from reluctant strings and a voice that could command attention in any room. Master Keller had organized musical entertainment for royal courts and religious festivals, but he had never been asked to provide therapy for a mass outbreak of involuntary dancing. The briefing that Master Keller received from Dr. Brenner and Father Metz was unlike any performance instructions he had ever heard. The physicians explained their theory that the dancers were experiencing a form of natural therapy that needed to be guided rather than interrupted. The goal was not to stop the dancing immediately, but rather to provide musical structure that might help the dancers gradually transition from their current compulsive state to something more controlled and ultimately restorative. Father Metz added the religious perspective, suggesting that the musicians might be serving as instruments of divine will, helping to facilitate a spiritual healing process that had begun spontaneously but needed human guidance to reach completion. The music would need to acknowledge the sacred dimensions of what was occurring while providing practical support for the physical and emotional needs of the dancers. Master Keller listened to these explanations with the professional interest of someone who had spent his career adapting his skills to meet unusual requests. He had played for weddings and funerals, for military campaigns and religious ceremonies, but the challenge of providing therapeutic music for a group of people who were already dancing to rhythms that only they could hear was entirely new to him. It would require careful observation, musical sensitivity, and a willingness to experiment with approaches that had no established precedent. The first step, Master Keller decided, was to study the dancers' existing movements in detail, identifying the rhythmic patterns and musical structures that seemed to be guiding their collective choreography. He spent the morning moving among the affected areas, listening carefully to the sounds of feet on cobblestones, observing the timing of arm movements and body turns, and trying to discern whatever internal music was driving the continuous performance. What he discovered was far more complex and sophisticated than he had expected. The dancers were not simply moving randomly or following a single shared rhythm. Instead, they seemed to be participating in an elaborate musical composition that existed only in their collective experience, with different individuals contributing different rhythmic and melodic elements to an overall structure that was both unified and varied. Some dancers moved in steady, walking rhythms that provided a basic pulse for the group's activities. Others added syncopated accents and decorative flourishes that created layers of complexity over the fundamental beat. Still, others seemed to be following melodic lines that rose and fell in patterns that suggested sophisticated musical thinking, even though no actual melodies were audible to outside observers. Master Keller realized that his musicians would need to become part of this existing musical structure rather than trying to impose a new one from outside. They would need to listen carefully to the unheard music that the dancers were following and then provide instrumental accompaniment that supported and enhanced what was already occurring. This would be similar to the challenge faced by musicians who joined in with folk dances or religious processions, where the music needed to serve the movement rather than dominating it. He gathered his musicians in a circle and explained the unusual nature of their assignment. They would be providing accompaniment for dancers who were already following musical patterns that existed only in their own experience. The goal was to make the invisible music audible, to give instrumental voice to the rhythms and melodies that were guiding the dancers' movements. The musicians responded to this challenge with the creative enthusiasm that characterized professional performers faced with an interesting technical problem. They began by stationing themselves at various points around the dancing areas, each focusing on a small group of dancers and trying to identify the specific rhythmic patterns that seemed to be guiding those particular individuals. The drummers were the first to find success, as rhythm was the most obvious element of the dancers' movements. Within an hour, several percussionists had identified basic pulse patterns that seemed to match what they were observing and had begun playing along with the invisible music. The effect was immediate and striking. The dancers seemed to respond to the audible rhythm with increased energy and more precise coordination, as if they were relieved to have their internal music validated and supported by external sound. The wind instruments joined in next, with flutists and reed players improvising melodic lines that seemed to complement the rhythmic foundation that the drummers had established. This required considerable musical sensitivity, as the melodies needed to match the rise and fall of the dancers' arm movements and the patterns of their steps across the cobblestones. The most successful instrumental melodies were those that seemed to grow organically from observation of the dancers, rather than being imposed from outside according to conventional musical rules. The string instruments presented a greater challenge, as their sustained tones and harmonic capabilities made them less obviously suited to the rhythmic focus of the dancing. But several lutanists and viol players found ways to contribute by providing harmonic support for the melodies that the wind instruments were developing and by adding rhythmic accents that complemented the percussion section. By afternoon, a remarkable transformation had taken place in the streets of Strasbourg. What had been an eerie scene of silent, compulsive movement had become something that resembled a community celebration, with dozens of professional musicians providing accompaniment for the continuous dance. The music was unlike anything that had been heard in the city before, improvised and experimental, but it seemed to serve its intended purpose of supporting and enhancing the dancers' activities. The effect on the dancers themselves was profound. With audible musical accompaniment for their movements, they seemed more relaxed and confident, their dancing becoming more elaborate and expressive. Some began to interact more directly with the musicians, moving close to particular instruments as if drawn by specific sounds, while others seemed to take on leadership roles within the dancing group, their movements becoming more prominent and influential in guiding the overall patterns of the collective performance. The effect on the broader community was equally significant. With musical accompaniment, the dancing no longer seemed like a disturbing medical or supernatural phenomenon, but rather like an unusual but potentially comprehensible community event. Crowds of observers gathered as they might for any public musical performance, and while they maintained a respectful distance from the dancers, their attitude was more curious than fearful. Master Keller moved among his musicians throughout the afternoon, offering suggestions and encouragement while monitoring the overall effect of their intervention. He was pleased with the progress they were making, but also aware that this was only the first phase of what was likely to be a lengthy process. The goal was not simply to provide musical accompaniment indefinitely, but rather to use music as a tool for gradually guiding the dancers toward a resolution of whatever underlying condition was driving their compulsive movement. As evening approached, Master Keller made a decision that would prove crucial to the ultimate success or failure of the musical intervention. Rather than stopping the music at nightfall, he organized his musicians into shifts that would allow them to provide continuous accompaniment throughout the night hours. This would ensure that the dancers never had to return to their previous state of silent, unaccompanied movement, and it would allow the musicians to maintain whatever therapeutic momentum they had established during their first day of performance. The night shift of musicians discovered that the dancers' behavior was different in darkness than it had been during daylight hours. The movements became more introspective and meditative, with fewer of the energetic leaps and spins that had characterized the afternoon dancing. The music adapted accordingly, with the musicians providing softer, more contemplative accompaniment that seemed to support the dancers' nocturnal rhythms. The flutists found that their instruments were particularly effective during the night hours, their gentle melodies seeming to guide the dancers through slower, more graceful movements that conserved energy while maintaining the continuous motion that appeared to be essential to their condition. The drummers switched to softer mallets and more subtle rhythmic patterns, creating a musical foundation that supported movement without overwhelming the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to settle over the dancing areas after dark. As the seventh day dawned, Master Keller assessed the results of the first 24 hours of musical intervention with cautious optimism. The dancers appeared to be healthier and more content than they had been before the musicians arrived. Their movements were more coordinated and expressive, and several individuals seemed to be showing signs of increased awareness of their surroundings and their condition. Most encouraging of all, the rate of new cases appeared to have slowed significantly since the musical accompaniment had begun. Whether this was due to the therapeutic effect of the music or simply a natural progression of the outbreak was impossible to determine. But Master Keller chose to interpret it as evidence that their intervention was having positive results. The success of the musical approach also seemed to vindicate the theories that Dr. Brenner and Father Metz had developed about the therapeutic and spiritual dimensions of the dancing sickness. With proper support and guidance, the phenomenon was proving to be manageable and potentially beneficial rather than destructive. The dancers were receiving whatever healing or spiritual experience they needed, while the broader community was learning to accept and even appreciate the remarkable events that were unfolding in their midst. However, Master Keller was also aware that the musical intervention was only a temporary measure. The goal remained to help the dancers complete whatever process they were undergoing and return to normal life. This would require careful observation of their progress and gradual modifications to the musical accompaniment that might guide them toward resolution of their condition. The challenge would be determining when and how to begin reducing the intensity and duration of the musical support, allowing the dancers to gradually regain control over their movements while ensuring that any underlying healing process was allowed to reach completion. This would be a delicate balance that would require all the musical sensitivity and therapeutic insight that Master Keller and his colleagues could muster. As the morning progressed, the musicians settled into their second day of continuous performance, their confidence growing with their understanding of the dancer's needs and responses. The streets of Strasbourg had become a stage for one of the most unusual musical collaborations in history, a partnership between professional performers and involuntary dancers that was creating something entirely new in human experience. The success of the musical intervention marked a turning point in the city's response to the dancing sickness, shifting from crisis management to therapeutic support. But it also raised new questions about the ultimate meaning and resolution of the phenomenon that would need to be addressed in the days and weeks to come. By the 10th day of the dancing sickness, the phenomenon had reached proportions that dwarfed anything the citizens of Strasbourg could have imagined when Frau Troffea first began her solitary performance. The narrow medieval streets that had once accommodated a few dozen dancers now pulsed with the movements of more than 400 individuals, their collective choreography transforming entire neighborhoods into vast, open-air ballrooms where the distinction between performer and audience had become increasingly blurred. The mathematical progression of the outbreak had followed a pattern that both fascinated and terrified the city's authorities. What had begun as isolated cases appearing every few hours had accelerated into a cascade of new afflictions that struck multiple individuals simultaneously. Entire families found themselves drawn into the dancing, followed by their neighbors, then by casual observers who had come to witness the spectacle only to discover that observation itself carried its own peculiar risks. Master Heinrich Weber, the senior guild representative who had been documenting the spread of the condition with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to all civic matters, reported that the demographics of the afflicted population defied every assumption about contagion and susceptibility. The dancers included infants who could barely walk and elderly individuals who had not moved with such vigor for decades. They came from every social class, every profession, every neighborhood of the city. The wealthy merchant Georg Zimmermann had joined the dancers on the 8th day, his fine clothing and gold jewelry creating a striking contrast with the simple garments of the craftsmen and laborers who had been among the earlier victims. His inclusion in the phenomenon sent shockwaves through Strasbourg's commercial community, as it demonstrated that neither wealth nor social position provided any protection against whatever force was driving the collective movement. Even more disturbing was the case of Sister Margarita, a nun from the convent of St. Agnes, who had been among the most vocal critics of the dancing, denouncing it from the cathedral steps as a manifestation of worldly temptation that good Christians should resist. Her transformation from critic to participant occurred with stunning suddenness during one of her sermonizing sessions, her words of condemnation dissolving into wordless song as her body began to move in the same patterns that she had been urging others to resist. The physical transformation of the city itself was as remarkable as the human drama unfolding within its walls. The normal rhythms of urban life, which had persisted largely unchanged for centuries, had been completely disrupted by the needs of the dancing population. Markets had been relocated to accommodate the continuous movement in the central squares, while workshops and businesses had adapted their operations to function around the streams of dancers that flowed through the streets like human rivers following courses that seemed to shift and change with mysterious logic. The most heavily affected areas had taken on an almost carnival-like atmosphere, with the professional musicians providing a constant soundtrack for activities that seemed to combine elements of religious procession, therapeutic exercise, and spontaneous celebration. Food vendors had established themselves at strategic locations, offering simple meals that dancers could consume quickly during brief pauses in their movement, while water carriers moved constantly through the crowds, ensuring that the performers remained hydrated despite their continuous exertion. The economic impact of the phenomenon had reached levels that threatened the fundamental stability of the city's commercial life, with nearly a quarter of the adult population unable to perform their normal occupations. Essential services were beginning to break down. Bakeries operated with skeleton crews. Blacksmith shops stood empty while their masters danced in the streets, and the river docks accumulated untended cargoes as dock workers joined the growing ranks of the afflicted. The city council found itself forced to implement emergency measures that had no precedent in municipal law or custom. They authorized the hiring of workers from neighboring towns to maintain essential services, established a special fund to support families whose primary breadwinners had been overcome by the dancing sickness, and created a new category of civic employee whose sole responsibility was to ensure the safety and basic needs of the dancers. Dr. Sebastian Brenner, whose initial optimism about the therapeutic nature of the phenomenon had been tempered by its unprecedented scale, spent his days moving among the dancers with a combination of medical fascination and growing concern. His theory that the dancing represented a form of collective healing remained plausible, but the sheer number of individuals involved suggested that the underlying conditions being addressed must be more widespread and serious than he had originally understood. His daily examinations revealed that the dancers remained in remarkably good physical condition despite their continuous exertion. Their cardiovascular systems had adapted to the sustained activity with improvements in stamina and coordination that would have been impressive in trained athletes. But he also noted subtle changes that suggested the phenomenon might be evolving in ways that could not be sustained indefinitely. Some of the earliest dancers, including Frau Trophy herself, were beginning to show signs of what Dr. Brenner could only describe as transcendence. Their movements had become so fluid and effortless that they seemed to exist in a different relationship to gravity and physical limitation than normal human beings. They danced for hours without apparent fatigue, their faces showing a serenity that suggested complete harmony between mind and body, between individual will and whatever collective force was guiding the group. But this apparent perfection came at a cost that was becoming increasingly visible to careful observers. These advanced dancers seemed to be losing some connection to the ordinary world of human relationships and practical concerns. When spoken to, they responded with increasing vagueness, as if their attention were focused on experiences that existed beyond the reach of normal language. They ate and drank when food and water were provided, but they showed little awareness of their basic physical needs and would continue dancing until exhaustion forced brief periods of rest. Father Andries Metz found himself grappling with theological questions that seemed to exist at the very boundaries of Christian doctrine. If the dancing represented a form of divine inspiration, as he had initially theorized, then the increasing otherworldliness of the most affected individuals might be understood as a deepening spiritual experience that was drawing them closer to direct communion with God. But if that were the case, what were the implications for their earthly lives and relationships? Several families had approached him with concerns about relatives who seemed to be disappearing into the dancing, even while remaining physically present in the community. A mother whose daughter had been among the early dancers reported that the young woman no longer recognized her family members or responded to her own name. A husband whose wife had joined the phenomenon described watching her transform from a loving companion into someone who seemed to inhabit an entirely different world, one where human attachments and earthly concerns had lost all meaning. These reports forced Father Metz to consider whether the dancing might represent not healing, but rather a form of spiritual crisis that was pulling individuals away from the human community rather than strengthening their connections to it. The line between religious ecstasy and dangerous detachment from reality was proving to be much thinner than his theological training had suggested, and he found himself uncertain about whether the phenomenon should be celebrated as a manifestation of divine grace or resisted as a threat to human well-being. Master Hans Keller and his musicians had become integral to the daily rhythm of the city, their continuous performance providing structure and support for the ever-growing population of dancers. But the musical demands of the situation were testing the limits of even these professional performers. The need to provide appropriate accompaniment for such a large and diverse group of dancers required constant improvisation and adaptation, while the physical demands of nearly continuous performance were beginning to take their toll on the musicians themselves. More troubling still were reports that several musicians were beginning to show signs of being affected by the very phenomenon they had been hired to treat. A young drummer had begun to sway in time with his own rhythms in ways that seemed to go beyond normal musical expression, while a flutist had been observed continuing to play even during designated rest periods, as if she were unable to stop producing the melodies that guided the dancer's movements. The possibility that the dancing sickness might spread to the musical performers who were providing its soundtrack raised alarming questions about the ultimate scope and trajectory of the outbreak. If even professional musicians, who presumably understood the power of rhythm and melody better than anyone, were susceptible to whatever force was driving the phenomenon, then perhaps no one in the community was truly safe from its influence. As the 10th day drew to a close, the city of Strasbourg found itself transformed into something that existed at the intersection of medical emergency, religious revival, and artistic performance. The dancing had become the dominant reality of urban life, affecting not only those who were directly participating, but everyone who lived and worked in the midst of the extraordinary spectacle. The authorities continued to maintain their policy of supportive management, providing practical assistance to the dancers while avoiding interventions that might disrupt whatever therapeutic or spiritual process was believed to be taking place. But the sustainability of this approach was being questioned by increasing numbers of citizens, who wondered whether the city could continue to function normally with such a large proportion of its population lost to the compelling rhythms of the dancing sickness. The peak of the madness had been reached, but its ultimate resolution remained as mysterious as its original cause. The dancers continued their relentless performance, guided by music that had become both audible and invisible, individual and collective, healing and potentially destructive. The city waited, with a mixture of fascination and fear, to discover what form of resolution would emerge from the most extraordinary episode in its long and generally peaceful history. As the dancing sickness entered its 3rd week, with the number of affected individuals continuing to fluctuate between 400 and 500 souls, the most learned minds of Strasbourg and the surrounding regions had converged upon the city to study what was rapidly becoming recognized as one of the most extraordinary phenomena in recorded history. The urgency of finding an explanation had grown beyond mere intellectual curiosity, as the practical challenges of managing such a large population of continuous dancers was straining the resources and administrative capabilities of the entire community. The University of Heidelberg had dispatched a team of scholars representing various disciplines, while similar delegations arrived from the universities of Paris, Vienna, and Prague. These men of learning brought with them not only their formal education and professional expertise, but also libraries of ancient texts, instruments for making precise observations, and most importantly, a variety of theoretical frameworks for understanding events that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. Master Johann Hartmann, the most senior of the visiting physicians, had spent 4 decades studying disorders of the mind and nervous system. His approach to the dancing sickness reflected the methodical rigor that characterized the best medical thinking of the early 16th century, combined with an openness to possibilities that conventional medical theory had not yet encompassed. He established a systematic program of observation and documentation that would provide future scholars with detailed records of the phenomenon, regardless of whether a satisfactory explanation could be developed during the actual outbreak. Dr. Hartmann's examination of the dancers revealed patterns that both supported and challenged existing medical knowledge. The physical health of the affected individuals remained remarkably good, with most showing improved cardiovascular fitness and muscular coordination compared to their condition before the dancing began. But their mental state was more difficult to assess, as they seemed to exist in a form of consciousness that was simultaneously heightened and restricted, intensely focused on their immediate physical experience while remaining largely disconnected from normal social and intellectual concerns. The visiting physician was particularly intrigued by the apparent communication that occurred between the dancers despite their minimal use of conventional language. They seemed to respond to each other's movements with a sensitivity that suggested some form of shared awareness, coordinating their actions in ways that produced complex group patterns without any obvious system of leadership or deliberate planning. This raised questions about the nature of consciousness itself and the possibility that human beings might possess capacities for collective awareness that were normally dormant or suppressed. Professor Wilhelm Agricola, a theologian from the University of Paris whose reputation for scholarship extended throughout the scholarly communities of Europe, brought a different perspective to the investigation of the dancing sickness. His analysis focused on the spiritual dimensions of the phenomenon, exploring parallels with various forms of religious experience that had been documented throughout Christian history. Professor Agricola had studied accounts of mystical experiences dating back to the earliest centuries of Christianity, and he found striking similarities between the behavior of the Strasbourg dancers and the ecstatic states described by various saints and mystics. The sustained physical activity, the apparent indifference to ordinary physical needs, and the serene expressions of the dancers all match descriptions of individuals who were believed to have achieved direct communion with divine reality. However, the collective nature of the Strasbourg phenomenon raised theological questions that had no clear precedent in Christian doctrine. While individual mystical experiences were well documented and generally accepted as authentic manifestations of divine grace, the simultaneous spiritual awakening of hundreds of people in a single community was without parallel in church history. This uniqueness made it difficult to apply established theological categories and interpretative frameworks to what was occurring in the streets of Strasbourg. Professor Agricola's theological analysis was further complicated by the apparent absence of traditional religious content in the dancers' experience. Unlike the mystics described in historical accounts, the affected individuals showed no particular interest in conventional forms of worship or devotion. They did not speak of visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary. They did not recite prayers or scriptures during their movements, and they seemed largely indifferent to the religious ceremonies and processions that were conducted for their benefit. This suggested to Professor Agricola that the dancing sickness might represent a new form of spiritual experience, one that transcended the boundaries of organized religion while still involving authentic contact with divine reality. If this interpretation were correct, it would have profound implications for understanding the relationship between formal religious practices and direct spiritual experience, potentially challenging some of the fundamental assumptions upon which institutional Christianity was based. Master Andreas Corvinus, a scholar of natural philosophy from the University of Vienna, approached the phenomenon from an entirely different direction, seeking explanations that relied on observable natural causes rather than supernatural intervention. His background in the study of celestial influences and their effects on human behavior led him to investigate whether the dancing sickness might be related to unusual astronomical conditions that had been present during the weeks when the outbreak began and spread. Master Corvinus' calculations revealed that the summer of 1518 had indeed been characterized by several notable celestial events, including a rare conjunction of Mars and Jupiter that occurred just days before Frau Trophy's first episode of dancing. According to the astrological knowledge of the time, such planetary alignments were believed to have powerful effects on human temperament and behavior, particularly in individuals whose personal horoscopes made them susceptible to such influences. This astrological explanation had the advantage of accounting for both the timing and the collective nature of the outbreak. If celestial conditions were indeed responsible for triggering the dancing sickness, it would explain why so many individuals had been affected simultaneously, and why the phenomenon had continued for such an extended period. The gradual changes in planetary positions might also explain the evolution of the dancers' behavior and the apparent deepening of their trance-like states over time. However, Master Corvinus was also aware of the limitations of astrological explanations when applied to specific individual cases. While celestial influences might create general predispositions towards certain types of behavior, they could not account for the precise details of how the dancing sickness manifested itself, or why some individuals were affected while others remained immune. The astrological framework provided a possible contributing factor rather than a complete explanation for the phenomenon. Dr. Marcus Steinberger, a physician whose specialty was the study of epidemic diseases, offered yet another perspective based on his extensive experience with outbreaks of various maladies that spread through communities in patterns similar to what was occurring in Strasbourg. His analysis focused on the mechanisms by which the dancing sickness was transmitted from person to person, seeking to understand the specific conditions that made individuals susceptible to the condition. Dr. Steinberger's observations suggested that the dancing sickness spread through a combination of direct observation and emotional contagion, similar to other forms of mass hysteria that had been documented in various communities throughout Europe. Individuals who spent extended periods watching the dancers seemed to be at higher risk of developing the condition themselves, particularly if they were already experiencing stress, anxiety, or other forms of psychological distress. This medical interpretation suggested that the dancing sickness might be understood as a form of collective psychological response to underlying social and economic pressures that were affecting the entire community. The summer of 1518 had been marked by crop failures, increased taxation, and rumors of military conflicts that threatened the stability and prosperity of the region. Perhaps the dancing represented a way for individuals to escape from these stresses temporarily, even if the escape came at the cost of losing conscious control over their behavior. Dr. Steinberger's theory was supported by his observation that many of the dancers were individuals who had been struggling with personal difficulties before their affliction began. The dancing might be serving as a form of psychological therapy, allowing people to release tensions and anxieties that they had been unable to address through normal means. The collective nature of the experience would provide social support and validation for this therapeutic process, making it more effective than individual treatments could be. As these various explanations were debated and refined by the visiting scholars, a consensus began to emerge around the idea that the dancing sickness was likely the result of multiple contributing factors rather than a single cause. The phenomenon seemed too complex and multifaceted to be explained adequately by any single theoretical framework, whether medical, religious, astrological, or psychological. Professor Hartmann proposed a synthetic interpretation that combined elements from all the major theories while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of what was occurring in Strasbourg. According to this integrated analysis, the dancing sickness represented a perfect storm of contributing factors, celestial influences that created general predispositions toward unusual behavior, social and economic stresses that made individuals psychologically vulnerable, and a specific triggering event that catalyzed these underlying conditions into a collective response. The religious dimensions of the phenomenon could be understood as authentic spiritual experiences that emerged naturally from this combination of factors, while the apparent therapeutic benefits reflected the body's innate wisdom in finding ways to address physical and psychological imbalances through rhythmic movement. The musical intervention provided by Master Keller and his colleagues was succeeding because it supported and enhanced these natural healing processes rather than attempting to interrupt them. This synthetic explanation offered hope that the dancing sickness would eventually resolve itself as the various contributing factors ran their natural course. The celestial influences would change as the planets moved through their cycles. The social and economic stresses would be addressed through community action and adaptation, and the therapeutic benefits of the dancing would eventually restore the affected individuals to normal health and behavior. However, the scholars were also aware that their theoretical understanding, however sophisticated, provided limited guidance for predicting exactly when or how the phenomenon would end. The dancing sickness had already lasted longer than any comparable outbreak in recorded history, and its ultimate resolution might require forms of intervention that had not yet been attempted or even imagined. As the third week of the outbreak drew to a close, the visiting scholars compiled their observations and theories into a comprehensive report that would be circulated to universities and learned societies throughout Europe. Their work represented the most systematic attempt yet made to understand the dancing sickness using the intellectual tools and knowledge available to 16th century scholarship. But even as they documented their findings and developed their explanations, the scholars remained humbled by the mystery of what they were witnessing. The dancing sickness had revealed aspects of human nature and social behavior that challenged many of their most fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between individual and collective experience, between mind and body, between the natural and supernatural worlds. Their theories provided frameworks for understanding, but the ultimate meaning of the phenomenon remained as elusive as the music that seemed to guide the dance's endless movements. The first signs of change in the dancing sickness became apparent during the fourth week of the outbreak. Subtle shifts in behavior and energy that were initially noticed only by the most careful observers who had been watching the phenomenon from its beginning. Master Hans Keller, whose musicians had been providing continuous accompaniment for the dancers for more than 2 weeks, was among the first to recognize that something fundamental was shifting in the rhythm and character of the collective performance that had transformed the streets of Strasbourg into a stage for one of history's most extraordinary episodes. The change began with the music itself. The professional musicians, who had developed an intuitive understanding of the dancer's needs through hundreds of hours of improvised accompaniment, found that their instruments were no longer leading the performance, but rather following it as the dancers began to generate their own musical structures. Soft humming had begun to emerge from some of the dancers, wordless melodies that seemed to arise spontaneously from their movements and that gradually spread through the group until entire sections of the dancing population were creating harmonies that complemented and occasionally replaced the instrumental music. This development was observed with particular interest by Dr. Sebastian Brenner, whose theory about the therapeutic nature of the dancing sickness seemed to be confirmed by what appeared to be the beginning of a natural resolution process. The emergence of vocal music from the dancers themselves suggested that they were regaining some conscious control over their condition, moving from purely involuntary movement towards something that incorporated elements of deliberate artistic expression. The duration of individual dancing sessions also began to change during the fourth week, where previously the afflicted individuals had moved continuously except for brief periods of exhaustion-induced rest. They now began to take more frequent and longer breaks. These pauses were not the sudden collapses that had characterized earlier rest periods, but rather gradual transitions into stationary positions where the dancers would stand or sit quietly, often swaying gently, but not engaging in the full-body movements that had defined their condition. During these rest periods, the dancers showed increased awareness of their surroundings and greater responsiveness to family members and friends. Conversations that had been impossible for weeks became feasible again, though the dancers often spoke in dreamy, reflective tones that suggested they were still processing experiences that were difficult to translate into ordinary language. They described feeling as if they had been on long journeys to distant places, even though their bodies had never left the familiar streets of Strasbourg. Frau Troffea, The woman whose solitary dance had begun the entire phenomenon was among the first to show signs of returning to normal consciousness. On the morning of the 23rd day, she was observed sitting quietly on the stone steps of a church, no longer moving, but clearly alert and aware of her surroundings. When approached by Dr. Brenner, she was able to engage in coherent conversation for the first time since her affliction had begun. Her description of her experience provided insights into the subjective reality of the dancing sickness that no external observation had been able to capture. She spoke of feeling as if she had been caught up in a great celebration, a festival of movement and music that had seemed to last for months, even though she intellectually understood that only a few weeks had passed. The dancing had felt not like a loss of control, but rather like a discovery of capabilities and experiences that she had never known she possessed. Most remarkably, Frau Troffier reported that her chronic melancholy, the condition that had plagued her for years before the dancing began, seemed to have completely disappeared. She felt more energetic and optimistic than she had in decades, as if the weeks of continuous movement had somehow reorganized her entire physical and emotional being. This apparent cure provided strong support for Dr. Brenner's therapeutic interpretation of the phenomenon. Similar patterns of recovery began to appear throughout the dancing population over the following days. The process was gradual and varied considerably between individuals, with some dancers transitioning smoothly back to normal behavior, while others experienced periods of confusion and disorientation as they readjusted to ordinary consciousness. But in almost every case, the return to normalcy was accompanied by reports of improved health and emotional well-being. The families of the affected individuals were among the first to notice these positive changes. Parents reported that children who had been sickly or troubled before the dancing began were now healthier and more confident. Spouses observed that their partners seemed more content and affectionate than they had been for years. Even elderly individuals who had joined the dancers despite their advanced age appeared to have gained new vitality and enthusiasm for life. Father Andreas Metz documented these reports of healing and transformation with the careful attention of someone who recognized their theological significance. If the dancing sickness had indeed served a therapeutic function, as now seemed increasingly clear, then it might be understood as an unusual form of divine intervention, a way for God to provide healing that conventional medicine and religious practices had been unable to achieve. The religious implications of the phenomenon became even more complex as Father Metz observed that many of the former dancers were showing increased interest in spiritual matters, though not necessarily in ways that conformed to traditional religious expression. They spoke of feeling more connected to their community and to the natural world, more aware of the interconnectedness of all living beings, and more confident about their place in the cosmic order. These were profoundly spiritual insights, but they seemed to transcend the boundaries of organized religion. The economic recovery of the city proceeded alongside the personal recovery of the individual dancers. As more people returned to their normal occupations, the disruptions to commerce and civic life that had characterized the peak of the outbreak began to resolve themselves. Shops reopened, markets returned to their regular schedules, and the essential services of urban life resumed their familiar patterns. However, the return to normalcy was not simply a restoration of pre-existing conditions. The experience of the dancing sickness had changed the community in ways that would prove to be permanent. The shared experience of witnessing and supporting such an extraordinary phenomenon had created bonds between neighbors and families that had not existed before. The city's response to the crisis had demonstrated capacities for cooperation and innovation that surprised even the civic leaders who had organized the relief efforts. Master Keller and his musicians found themselves in the unique position of having participated in the resolution of the very phenomenon they had been hired to address. As the dancers gradually returned to normal life, the need for continuous musical accompaniment diminished, but many of the former dancers requested that the musicians continue to perform regularly in the city's public spaces. The music that had served a therapeutic function during the crisis became a source of ongoing pleasure and community celebration. The visiting scholars who had come to study the dancing sickness found their observations and theories validated by the pattern of its resolution. The gradual, natural conclusion of the phenomenon supported Dr. Brenner's therapeutic interpretation, while the spiritual dimensions of the recovery process confirmed Professor Agricola's religious analysis. Master Corvinus' astrological calculations suggested that the changing celestial influences were indeed contributing to the dancer's return to normal behavior. Most importantly, the resolution of the dancing sickness demonstrated that the phenomenon had been fundamentally benign rather than destructive. What had initially appeared to be a medical emergency or supernatural crisis had proven to be a form of collective healing that addressed individual and community needs that conventional approaches had been unable to meet. The dancers had not been victims of some mysterious malady, but rather participants in an extraordinary form of therapy that operated according to principles that medical and religious authorities were only beginning to understand. By the end of the 5th week, fewer than 50 individuals remained in the full dancing state, and even these showed signs of the gradual transition toward normal consciousness that had characterized all the previous recoveries. The streets of Strasbourg, which had been filled with continuous movement and music for more than a month, began to return to their familiar rhythms of daily commerce and social interaction. The dancing sickness had not ended with dramatic finality, but had faded away gradually, like music growing softer until it could no longer be heard. The last dancers were observed during the 6th week, and by the beginning of July, the phenomenon that had transformed an entire community had become a memory, though one that would be preserved in the stories and songs of Strasbourg for generations to come. The resolution of the dancing sickness left the city with a paradox that would challenge historians and scholars for centuries to follow. An event that had initially appeared to threaten the very fabric of civic life had ultimately strengthened the community and improved the health and well-being of hundreds of individuals. What had seemed like madness had proved to be a form of wisdom that transcended conventional understanding, a reminder that human nature contained possibilities that ordinary experience rarely revealed. As the summer of 1518 drew toward its close, the citizens of Strasbourg returned to their familiar routines with a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that lay just beneath the surface of everyday life. The dancing plague had ended, but its lessons about the power of music, the possibilities of healing, and the unexpected ways that communities could respond to crisis would remain part of the city's collective memory forever. The merchants reopened their stores with stories to tell visiting traders about the summer when their city had been transformed into a stage for miracles. The craftsmen returned to their workshops with new appreciation for the rhythms that guided their work. The families gathered around their dinner tables with gratitude for experiences that had brought them closer together while revealing capacities for resilience and adaptation that they had never known they possessed. The dancing plague of 1518 had ended not with catastrophe, but with celebration, not with destruction, but with healing, not with answers, but with a deepened appreciation for the questions that make human existence endlessly fascinating and eternally mysterious.